Hello historians, this is Mrs. Tyler. Today we are doing Unit 2, Notes 4, War of 1812. These 2 pages in our notes packet. Okay, it's early 1800s and Great Britain and France have been at war on and off for over 50 years. By 1803, the leader of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, is on a quest to overpower most of Europe. Britain has the world's most powerful navy and a very strong army, but Napoleon is very determined. Britain was still irritated with the U.S. since we won independence in 1781. Britain still owns all of Canada and wants to reclaim lands in the interior part of North America. U.S. economy relies on trading goods with both France and Britain, but France doesn't want the U.S. to trade with Britain, and Britain doesn't want us to trade with France. The first 3 presidents have had to negotiate with both countries to protect U.S. interests. So we talk about how there are going to be 3 causes of the War of 1812. British interfering with our shipping, British kidnapping U.S. sailors and forcing them to serve in the British Navy, that's called impressment, and the British supplying Native Americans with weapons and ammunition and inciting or encouraging them to attack settlements of white Americans settling on the frontier. So let's fill this in for shipping. When the U.S. wouldn't stop trading with France, the British Navy began attacking U.S. merchant ships heading for France. U.S. ships in the Atlantic Ocean and throughout the Great Lakes were at risk from British attack. The British Navy was the largest and most powerful in the world. So in your notes, you're going to write the British Navy was attacking U.S. ships heading to trade with France. The British Navy would stop U.S. ships and board them. They accused sailors on the U.S. ships of being British who had fled England. They would kidnap them and force them to serve the British Navy. The British Navy was kidnapping U.S. sailors. That word is impressment. It's one of our vocab words. As settlers moved into the Ohio River Valley and Mississippi River Valley, many American Indian nations were pushed off their lands. The U.S. discovered that Britain was stirring up trouble among the Indians in the Northwest. The British hoped that helping the Indians would scare off American settlers and ultimately give Britain control of the interior part of the continent. The British helped the Indians resist U.S. settlers in the Northwest. So they're leading these attacks. One of the groups of Native people are the Shawnee, and this is Shawnee chief Tecumseh. He and his brother the Prophet had worked together to try to unify many of the Indian nations and Indian tribes in their region. They wanted to make one confederacy of Native Americans to work together to fight off American settlement or white settlement. Supplied with weapons from Britain, they led warriors in attack on settlements at Tippecanoe Creek in Indiana in November of 1811. Indiana's governor, William Henry Harrison, led a militia in the state to put down the uprising. Okay. So Tecumseh is a Shawnee chief who leads Indian resistance to U.S. settlement. On the timeline at the bottom of the second page of notes today is 1811. Britain helped Indians fight the U.S. at the Battle of Tippecanoe. So with all this stuff going on in Britain kind of pushing all of our buttons, we've got 2 sides of Americans arguing over what we should do next. Many Americans are fed up with the British, but not all citizens were interested in going to war. American trade relied on doing business with Britain and France, and merchants in New England didn't want to jeopardize their business with Britain. Others felt it was time the U.S. stood up for itself in foreign affairs. Some hoped that we would take over Canada. So isolationists are the group of Americans who don't want to go to war. They want to keep trading with Britain, and they felt that the odds were against our country, that the British have the most powerful military in the world, and we couldn't possibly hope to be successful in fighting another war with them. On the other hand, we have war hawks who are clamoring to do something about all of Britain's pestering and bullying of us. So they want to make the frontier safe again for U.S. settlers. They want to add Canada to the United States, and they want to protect our shipping rights. So James Madison, who's president at the time, has a dilemma. He's a little bit hesitant. Was our country strong enough to take on the most powerful military in the world? The U.S. Navy had only 20 ships, while the British had over 1,000 in their Royal Navy. But Britain was also fighting Napoleon over in Europe. So declaring war right now, James Madison thought would be a better idea because they would have to divide their military and their efforts to fight in two places at once. So Madison became the first U.S. president to go to Congress and ask them to declare war. And they declared war on Great Britain in 1812. So James Madison is the first president to shift away from our previous foreign policies of the first three presidents of trying to be isolationist and stay neutral in those situations. At this point, we've tried that for a pretty long time, and it's coming to a point where we just feel like we can't let this go on anymore without standing up for ourselves. So on that timeline on the second page, you're going to write that the U.S. declared war on Great Britain in 1812. In 1812 to 1813, for the first year of the war, most of the battles took place at sea in the Atlantic and the Great Lakes between the U.S. and Canada. This is because Britain's army is mainly focusing on fighting France over there in Europe. So they don't send very many troops. There were some that were in Canada, but most of the battles in the first year of this war are going to be battles at sea. The U.S. saw a few victories on Lake Erie, but even with Britain dividing their military fighting France, U.S. victories were difficult and rare. The U.S. and Britain fought nearly 40 naval battles in the Atlantic and the Great Lakes. So you're going to write, early in the war, most battles were fought at sea. Nearly 40 naval battles were fought in the Atlantic and Great Lakes. The U.S. thought that they could simply conquer Canada by marching right in, and they were wrong. Each time the U.S. forces crossed into Canada, the British forced them back. There were a few victories for the U.S. at the Battle of Lake Erie and Battle of the Thames. Shawnee Chief Tecumseh was fighting on the side of the British. He died at the Battle of the Thames in 1813, and this is going to have a big impact because he was the one who was trying to unify so many of the different native tribes. Without his leadership, things are going to be a little bit rocky for the Native American Confederacy. So the U.S. was unsuccessful each time they tried to invade Canada. Some Indians fought on the side of the British. In 1814, the British defeated Napoleon in France and turned their full military force on the United States. Troops were sent into Canada and also attacked military forts in Baltimore. The British Army invaded Washington, D.C. and burned several public buildings, including the White House. President Madison and his wife Dolly had to flee for their lives. This is the story where Dolly Madison heroically runs through the White House and grabs as many of the valuable documents and paintings as she can and rescues the portrait of President Washington. So, Britain attacked military forts along the coast. The British invaded Washington, D.C. and set fire to the White House. Important victories for the United States occur at Fort McHenry and in New Orleans. At that Battle of Fort McHenry, there was this gentleman. His name's Francis Scott Key. So while they were attacking the fort at Fort McHenry outside of Baltimore, Francis Scott Key, who's an American lawyer, had actually earlier in the day gone out and boarded a British frigate ship to try to negotiate the release of a couple of American sailors from the British. And so he was acting as their lawyer, and then the battle starts up and the British won't let any of them leave the ship. So he's trapped on this ship in the harbor, watching as the British just bombard all night long, bombard the military fort, Fort McHenry. He watched through the night, and when dawn broke, he's thrilled to see that the United States flag was still waving over the fort. That meant that the U.S. still controlled the fort. That means they won that battle and the British lost. If the British had won, they would have taken the American flag down and replaced it with the British flag. So he's so relieved to see the U.S. flag still flying over the fort that he writes a poem to express his feelings. Later, that poem becomes the words for our national anthem. Okay, so he wrote the words to the Star-Spangled Banner. And as a class, we watched a little video showing Whitney Houston singing the Star-Spangled Banner, but if you go to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., you can actually see the flag that was at the Battle of Fort McHenry that inspired the national anthem is hanging there, and it's giant. It's crazy big. All right. A British fleet had surrendered to the U.S. forces at the Battle of Lake Champlain in New York just 2 days before they had that unsuccessful attack on Fort McHenry. At the same time, the U.S. still had failed to push the British from Canada, and they were embarrassed by the invasion of Washington, D.C. So neither side is having a whole lot of success in this war. They kind of are growing weary of it. Both sides are ready to end the war. So they negotiate to sign a peace treaty, and the Treaty of Ghent is signed in December of 1814. However, news was really slow to travel. It takes weeks and weeks for the news of the signing of the treaty to get back to the United States and to be sent out to the various places where battles had been happening. So there's going to still be some battles after the fact, after the treaty had already been signed. So the Treaty of Ghent was signed in December of 1814. It formally ended the war. News was slow to travel, and neither side could truly claim a victory. The British did not get to reclaim the U.S. The U.S. doesn't get to claim Canada. So, I mean, neither of us got our main objective with this. Last date on the timeline, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent ended the War of 1812. Ironically, the greatest U.S. victory came after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, before news of peace had reached New Orleans. General Andrew Jackson and a ragtag army of 7,000 militia, free African Americans, Indians, and pirates all worked together to defend the port city of New Orleans. 2,000 British were killed or wounded compared to only 20 Americans. While the battle was unnecessary, General Jackson becomes a war hero. That will serve him well when he runs for president later on to be our 7th president. All right. There are 3 effects of the War of 1812. Feelings of loyalty and patriotism surged. Tecumseh died, and Indian resistance in the Northwest weakens without him there to unify those Native American tribes. And probably the biggest importance to this, the U.S. learned to produce more when they couldn't trade during the war. So we were kind of in a trade drought, meaning we weren't able to trade with very many countries. We had been importing and buying fabric and textiles from Britain and some other manufactured goods because they were undergoing their first industrial revolution. And they had come up with ways for machines to take over and, not take over, but for machines to do a lot of the work that had once been done by hand. We didn't have that going on for us. So Britain could mass produce these textiles, these bolts of fabric and cloth, way faster and for less money than we could. When we can't trade with them, though, we have to figure out how we're going to get access to those items. So instead of being able to trade, we have to come up with our own industries. We have to figure out how to build our own factories and produce this stuff on our own, which actually ends up being a blessing for our country because it impacts our economy. It makes more job opportunities, and we start to be able to export our own stuff and sell that to other countries and compete with British. All right, that's the cause and effects of the War of 1812. Thanks for joining us.